Welcome, Excellencies, Ambassadors, and honorable guests. Please be seated. Good afternoon, Excellencies, Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to FPCI Public Forum. Today's forum is held in a hybrid format, meaning that it is convened in person as well as online through YouTube live streaming. And for everybody who is attending this forum in person here at Bengkel Diplomacy, we would like to say welcome to FPCI. We also would like to say hi and welcome to everybody who is tuning in online through our YouTube live stream. We have around 150 participants in total coming in from all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia is the largest foreign policy group in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, with over 100,000 people in our network from all across Indonesia and all over the world. And ladies and gentlemen, we are very glad to have you here joining us at our public forum. First of all, before we begin, let us give a warm welcome to our honorable guest today, Mr. Bashir Ahmed, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Indian Embassy in Indonesia. Welcome to FPCI, Mr. Ahmed. We also would like to welcome Ambassador Sumadi Brotodiningrat, Board Member of FPCI, and Ambassador Najib Rifat Kesuma, Senior Fellow at FPCI. Welcome, Ambassadors. And ladies and gentlemen, today's public forum is titled India's Foreign Policy Updates, G20, Indo-Pacific, and Minilateralism with His Excellency Sujan Shenoy. As it is titled, we have our distinguished speaker from India today, His Excellency Sujan Shenoy, the Chair of Think 20 India 2023. Welcome, Excellency, and we hope that you are enjoying Jakarta this far. We also have here with us today Dr. Sofwan Albana Khoiruzad, a senior fellow at FPCI who will be joining as a panelist. Welcome again to FPCI, Dr. Sofwan. And ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, let us first watch a quick video highlights of FPCI. Please enjoy. to begin, we would like to invite Ambassador Sumadi Brotodiningrat, board member at FPCI, to deliver his opening remarks. To Ambassador Sumadi, you may have the floor.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sehat, salam sejahtera. Very good afternoon to all of you. Ambassador Sujan, welcome to FPCI. On a personal note, I'm very happy and privileged to have the opportunity to introduce somebody who have the same affinity as myself, because both of us once upon a time served as ambassadors in Japan. So we share a common experience, although at different time. And of course, as the Master of Ceremony has already mentioned to you, FPCI, or Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, was founded in 2015, to spread positive internationalism throughout Indonesia and the world. We have grown to be the largest foreign policy group in Southeast Asia, with more than 100 people in our network. We are particularly strong on the grassroots, and as you can see, we have students, academicians, and various CSOs and NGOs attending to this event. That's why I'm delighted that we have you, Mr. Sujan, with us today. As we all know, Indonesia and India not only have the same long history of friendship and cooperations, but we are both now sharing the same responsibility in the Troika of the G20. You are not the chairman, we are member of Troika, and we hope that your visit in Indonesia, Ambassador, you can learn from us the experience that we had last year. Learning from experience, you know as well as I do, is, of course, not only to learn the successes, but also the challenges that Indonesia was facing last year, so that you can anticipate what may happen to you in a full knowledge of our experience. And especially in chairing the T20, you will, I think, have many inputs in this afternoon discussions, because I'm sure that under the able leadership of our moderator, there will be comments and questions raised to you. And I think my friends here in this room, as well as the one who follow your presentation online, are anxious to listen to you. And I hope that this is not only benefit to us in listening to you, but I hope that you too will take advantage of what we will, our colleagues here will say about things that perhaps you will face in your chairmanship later on. So without further ado, I don't want to prolong unnecessarily what I've said, and once again welcome, Ambassador, and I would like to, where is yes, I ask the Master of Ceremony to invite you to take the floor, please.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Ambassador Sumadi. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us begin our forum. And for that, I would like to hand the floor to Dr. Amelia Liwe, the head of G20 Study Center at Universitas Pelita Harapan, to begin the discussion. Dr. Amelia, you may have the floor.
Thank you. Hello everyone, selamat siang, good afternoon. How are you today? Great, fine, okay. I'm very excited too. Today we have a special guest, and of course we want to learn a lot from our special guest. So I want to introduce him briefly. He has a long, a vast diplomatic experience, but I just want to highlight several things. Our guest today, the chair of Think 20 2023. As we all know, that G20 presidency of India started December 1st, 2022. So one of the engagement group is T20. So it has been a privilege to welcome our special guest. He is a very experienced diplomat, and also from the bio that I received, he also has a long experience with a think tank in India. And Ambassador can maybe further explain or introduce your think tank. But today, we are going to welcome Ambassador Sujan Chinoy. Previously, Ambassador Chinoy served as the ambassador of India to Japan and Marshall Islands, and also Ambassador Chinoy served as the ambassador of India to Mexico. And there's a long list, Ambassador, so I shouldn't read all the list. But without further ado, let's join me to welcome Ambassador Chinoy, and then we are going to learn a great deal from him about, many things. Foreign policy of India, G20 presidency of India. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege for me to be invited to the foreign policy community of Indonesia and to stand before you in my capacity as the Think 20 chair for India's G20 presidency, as also in my personal capacity as the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses of India. I am particularly grateful to Ambassador Somadi Broto Dinigrat for that introduction, and Madam Dr. Liwe also for that warm introduction. As we walked in, I could see that the logo that you have for conducting positive internationalism within the nation and around the world is something that I can readily identify with, for I come from India, which, like Indonesia, is one of the world's largest countries, one of the world's most populous countries, one of the world's most diverse countries in the whole of the world. And I could readily relate to our history. I could readily relate to the sentiments that were expressed about Indonesia wanting to be an independent and autonomous power, one that would do good with regard to maritime security, with regard to climate change. For India, as you all know, is an ancient country, a country that has a very long history, and civilizationally, we have much in common. You are aware that India and Indonesia have age-old links. These links, in fact, are both civilizational, cultural, and maritime in nature. The great religion of Islam came to Indonesia by the maritime route after a stopover in India, and more particularly in terms of its spread it also came with trade and other cultural people-to-people exchanges. So we are no strangers to one another. And yet I lament the fact that I had to come to Indonesia via Malaysia, and that there are no direct flights. So one of the first recommendations I want to make is that, in keeping with this great relationship that we have, more particularly the strategic partnership that we are building today, there should be direct connectivity between India and Indonesia. Having said that, let me begin by basically briefly painting for you India's foreign policy, the picture as I see it. India is a country that essentially looks to developing its economy rapidly in an inclusive manner. And for that, we need peace and stability on our periphery. And the fundamental principles of peace and non-violence, these have been guiding principles of Indian civilization for centuries, from the time of Gautam Buddha to Mahatma Gandhi. Seamlessly, we can see that India stands for peace and non-violence. India also stands for the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is to say, the entire world is one family. That kind of sentiment which I saw in your representative video as well. In fact, if we substitute the word Indonesia with the word India, your introductory video and all the sentiments that you expressed would eminently suit India's outlook as well. So that is how close our outlook would be in the 21st century. India is a country that today has 1.4 billion people. By some accounts, we have already overtaken the People's Republic of China as the world's most populous nation. And a full 65% of our people are below the age of 35. And I therefore want to acknowledge and recognize the presence of the youth over here in the audience. It is also Valentine's Day. But for me, Valentine's Day has a completely different meaning. For me, Valentine's Day is a day on which we need to acknowledge that this world today increasingly needs a heavy dose of compassion, a heavy dose of sympathy for peoples around the world, especially at times of crisis. So Valentine's Day for me means love for humanity in general. And in keeping with India's principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world, the entire world is one family. So let us also dedicate ourselves, the youth especially, for you are the future of the world. Let us dedicate ourselves to really that kind of global fraternity that I wish to emphasize. It's part of our cultural DNA as well. India is a country that today seeks to grow and develop its economy. And coming out of the pandemic, you're all aware that India has, today emerged as the fastest growing large economy in the world, with growth rates of about 6.8% per annum. And for the projected near future, perceivable future, India is expected to grow at 6.5% or so. This means that India, which is already the world's fifth largest economy today, having overtaken the UK, is likely to be in the front-ranking economies within the top 2 or the top 3 by the middle of this century. And it is therefore with good reason that Goldman Sachs had predicted more than 20 years ago that of all the BRIC countries, for it was BRIC at that time, South Africa joined only in 2009, and this prediction was made by Goldman Sachs economists around 2001, that of all the BRIC countries, India was the one most suitably placed to grow at 5% or more continuously up to the middle of this century. And as we speak, India has celebrated last year the 75th anniversary of its independence, and has now entered what is increasingly described as the period of Amrit Kal, which is to say the period between now and 2047, when India will celebrate its centenary. This is the Amrit Kal period, or the Ambrosia period, the period of the nectars. coming to play as we churn the oceans in the Indo-Pacific, what we call Sagar Manthan in Sanskrit. The ambrosia floats up to the top. So during Amrit Kal, between now and 2047, India is expected to grow and become, in our sort of vision, a developed country. And that is what is represented today. So as we look out, India wishes to seek a peaceful periphery, to build good neighborly relations in South Asia. I lament the fact that South Asia has one of the lowest percentages of intra-regional trade. And that is where we look at East Asia, we look at Southeast Asia with admiration. And this is really behind the sentiment expressed by the Prime Minister of India that we need a neighborhood first policy. A neighborhood first policy in which we seek the growth and progress and development not only of the people of India, but also the people of the entire region. For it is only when the entire region develops that India will have the confidence to march into the 21st century on the basis of what you call a regional acceptability, regional support, and that would sustain India's growth much better in the 21st century. So our neighborhood first policy is critical today. It is a policy in which we seek to give without reciprocity. One of the fundamental underlying principles of India's foreign policy is not to seek reciprocity, but to give according to our capacity. And as India's economy grows and develops, as we have crossed the $3 trillion mark, as we are now set on a high growth trajectory, India's capacity to give in a pro bono manner to meet the needs of its friends and neighbors is growing. And it is with that intent and purpose that India also seeks very good relations to the west of India. To the west of India, we, being a maritime nation, seek to contribute to growth and development and prosperity across all the way to the east coast of Africa, where we have many strategic partners. We have ancient civilizational maritime links between the Zanj coast of East Africa and the western coast of India. And we also are working on several bilaterals, trilaterals, minilaterals, the most important of which resonates today is, of course, the new trilateral between India, the UAE, and France, for instance. And one of the underlying themes behind this is that all these three countries are essentially stakeholders in the Western Indian Ocean, and we can bring to bear our respective advantages. And you may ask, why this particular combination? And I would attempt to answer that question on this minilateral by saying that India always has traditional interests in the Western Indian Ocean. We have 8 million people in the Gulf. We have $100 billion worth of remittances coming into India every year, the largest in the world. A large part of that comes from the Gulf region. We have age-old links with Africa, and we have, in fact, trade and other interests, including the protection of sea lines of communication, energy, container traffic, cargo, etc., to look at in terms of our strategic priorities. This is a region in which the ugly head of terrorism, radicalization, and also piracy have been seen in recent years. So India has great stakes in ensuring peace and stability in the maritime theater to the west of India. A country like the UAE, for instance, very well endowed, also has growing interests as a regional power. The UAE, for instance, has been participating in the Combined Maritime Task Force 150, which is essentially in that part of the world to protect what you call ensure regional security, including counterterrorism. And we have, for instance, France, which is also part of the combined task forces in that part of the world. France is a resident power in the Indian Ocean with territories such as the Mayotte Island and Reunion and other former territories such as Mauritius and Seychelles, the Comoros Islands, etc. So this kind of a mini-lateral would bring combined strengths together. As we look at, for instance, our relations with Afghanistan, I can say with conviction that we have ancient links with Afghanistan, and we stand for an Afghanistan that is at peace with itself and its neighbors. We believe that Afghanistan should be given a chance to decide for itself the kind of government that it wants to put in place. So it should be an Afghan-led process in general. But the return of the Taliban obviously has created a new sort of anxiety in the region at large, particularly because of the rise of the ISIS Khorasan in the region, and the manner in which it also spares no one, including attacking the Taliban. So that kind of uncertainty and flux in Afghanistan is good for no one. When we look at major countries of the Gulf like Saudi Arabia or Iran, I'm happy to inform you that India has done exceptionally well by actually following what you call a path, a balanced path in which we have good relations with both parties. So India is one of the few countries in the world with credibility that has been able to, for instance, maintain good relations, excellent relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. And our cooperation with Saudi Arabia in particular is growing by leaps and bounds, including in the security domain, including in the maritime security domain, including in terms of intelligence sharing today. When we look at the larger issue, the Palestinian issue, while we support the Palestinians, we also have excellent ties with Israel. So there is yet another example of India having credibility on both sides. We also, for instance, have excellent relations today with the United States of America as well as with the Russian Federation. The United States of America and India, often referred to as the two estranged democracies of the past, today are no longer estranged. The United States today is India's most important and largest strategic partner. We have growing trade, economic and technological ties. We have growing cooperation in the sphere of defense and security. The largest number of exercises that we do with any country in the world today, military exercises, are with the United States of America. And the United States has also long declared India as a major defense ally, as you know, as well as accorded to us the STA Tier 1 authorization with regard to trade, with regard to the export of certain high-end technologies, which otherwise would not have been possible from the United States to India. So the days of sanctions against India after its first nuclear test in 1974, or for that matter, the brief interregnum after 1998 when we tested our nuclear weapons, and relations with the US had experienced some friction. That's simply a matter of the past. Today, we stand together for a free and open Indo-Pacific and for a rules-based international order, and the willingness to work together for the larger good. At the same time, I must say that we have excellent ties with the Russian Federation. Russia, as you all know, is an old friend of India. It's also a legacy state of the Soviet Union, and India always had very good ties with the Soviet Union. There was a time in the 50s when we were looking at our Fabian socialism. We were seeking to develop our economy, heavy industries. It was the Soviet Union that assisted India in setting up many of its steel plants and factories. It was the Soviet Union in 1961 that enabled India to set up its first production of the MiG-19 fighter aircraft. We produced almost nearly 800 of them. And some of the latest, updated versions are still in service in India, though more modern aircraft have been inducted for quite some time now. And the Russian Federation, like the Soviet Union in the past, had stood by India when it came to critical issues concerning India with regard to sovereignty or territorial integrity, especially during discussions in the UN Security Council. Russia is also a provider of energy to India, and we continue to source energy from Russia because energy is fungible. Oil has no identity, and gas has no identity even today, despite the misgivings that the Europeans have with regard to Russia's behavior in Ukraine. You still see large amounts of energy from Russia finding its way one way or the other to the European Union. And so India must provide for its people rapid economic development, and for that cheap energy is vital. And we are determined to obviously source it from wherever it is available. If it happens to be cheap and available from the Russian Federation, we will obviously, alongside buying large quantities from Saudi Arabia and Iraq, our two other great partners, aside from buying large quantities from the United States of America, which has emerged in recent years not only as a major producer, but also post their legislative changes as a major exporter. Aside from that, we continue to buy large quantities from the Russian Federation. We owe it to the people of India to give them cheaper energy to ensure that we have rapid economic growth and development. With regard to China, we have ancient ties. We have coexisted for millennia. And for the most part, these ties were peaceful. They were civilizational in contact. But in those days, we were not divided by what you call borders and boundaries. We had frontiers. And frontiers always provided that overlapping space. We had that kind of toing and froing of merchantmen and pilgrims between the two countries, of those that sought knowledge, like the ancient travelers Xuanzang and Faxian, who came to India, in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th centuries AD. These great travelers did not have any 21st century notions of the modern state. They were hungry for knowledge. They were hungry for brotherhood. They wanted to unite the world, to make the world a better place. Today we have a very complex relationship with China as a result of the unsettled boundary dispute, and there are deep concerns in India at the unilateralism, the militarization, the sort of developmental finance that comes out of China, more particularly the kind of unilateral action that China has taken on India's borders since 2020. India is determined to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and obviously we also look to, in the future, to have better relations with China. Our dialogue will continue with this neighbor. And when we look further towards the east, our Act East policy has given fresh vigor to our ties with Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia remains one of the most important objectives of our Indian foreign policy. And we seek to promote our cultural ties and physical connectivity between particularly the northeast of India and Southeast Asia. And in this task, we also see the potential for working together with third countries like Japan, for instance. Japan has its own policy of enhanced partnership for quality infrastructure, as they call it. And it has a fairly good record of working on infrastructure and capacity building projects in Southeast Asia. And India is open to the idea of, therefore, working with third countries. Having briefly stated this, let me quickly move to the Indo-Pacific and mention a few words about what exactly is the Indo-Pacific and what exactly is the Asia-Pacific. And today this discourse is very much going around in think tanks, in policy fora, at the high tables of policy making. There are people who support the Indo-Pacific. There are people who have misgivings about the Indo-Pacific. But I'll try to put it briefly before you in context. The way I see it is that the Asia-Pacific is a very important construct that came about essentially after the Second World War. When the World War II ended, we could see Japan as a country that had been completely devastated, a power that had tried to militarize rapidly and challenge the sort of liberal, global, open, democratic order was defeated. It was a vanquished power. And in the 50s, after the necessary changes were made to the Japanese constitution, the peaceful Pacific constitution, Japan's orientation changed. It became one of the leading economies that rose in East Asia. And when it became the center of manufacturing activity for automobiles, for electronics, for white goods, etc., it also was exporting vast quantities to that one big market, that is the United States of America, across a certain body of water called the Pacific. And therein lie the root, the seeds of the Asia Pacific. Japan was not the only one. Shortly thereafter, we see the miraculous rise of the Asian tigers that also industrialized, became large economies, and were exporting to that same one big North American market. And later we also saw the astonishing rise of the Chinese economy post their reforms and modernization in the 1970s. So that 50-year period between the end of the Second World War, that 55-year period until the end of the 20th century, that is the period of the Asia Pacific. But something else happened thereafter. This kind of shifting of global engines of growth and development to Asia was no longer restricted to a certain geography in East Asia. It was no longer confined to Japan, no longer was it confined to the Asian tigers, no longer was it confined to, the People's Republic of China. Within East Asia, growth and development had been taken for granted, but we soon began to see the results of growth and prosperity elsewhere. These big towers that you see, skyscrapers in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Thailand. So growth and prosperity beginning this century began to spread over a much larger, broader region. It was no longer confined even to Southeast Asia. It began to be very much apparent in South Asia, in the rise of India in the last 2 decades, and also the rise of countries like Bangladesh, which outperformed India in certain sectors, especially in textiles. And no longer was it confined to South Asia. It was also shifting and radiating out this growth, process, peace, progress, prosperity to dynamic regions of Africa, particularly Anglophone, and Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa on the eastern seaboard of Africa. So what we see in this century is the rise of the Indo-Pacific. Without any strategic attendants also, these two great oceanic spaces have always been historically connected. And let me say how they are connected. They are connected across the 6 key factors that are factors of globalization and yet challenged by globalization. The first T is that of trade. Trade today unites the world. It unites these two oceanic spaces. It is also undergoing great stress today as a result of trade protectionism, as a result of the dysfunctionality seen in the WTO, and as a result of this desire to move towards regionalism, regional FTAs, bilateralism, and so on and so forth. The second T that is challenged and which connects these two spaces and all that lies in between, including the Eurasian landmass, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Pacific Ocean, the landmass in between, the continental spaces, we are connected by the second T, and that T is that of technology. Today, technology both unites and divides. And increasingly, the high ends of technology are more subject to contestation and friction, as we have seen in case of 5G, AI, etc. Space-based, intelligence and surveillance systems. We see the clash over there. We see the restrictive aspects on export controls and sanctions, etc. The third T is that of territory. Territorial disputes, no matter how hard the region has worked to resolve them, are still dotting this region. Whether it is the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, whether it is the Dokdo problem between Japan and Korea, whether it is the South China Sea problem, whether it is the problem that Indonesia has with regard to violation of its exclusive economic zone, even without a dog in the fight in terms of territory, your EEZ is still challenged. It is challenged by the phenomenon of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And like India, Indonesia stands for no nonsense and has shown that it is autonomous and capable of taking firm action in a balanced way whenever required. So we have seen that territory also divides this region today. It also connects the region. Then there is the T of terrorism. One must not forget terrorism, because without dealing with the T of terrorism, you cannot hope to establish peace and stability. Without peace and stability, there will be no progress. So therefore, terrorism is something that we need to also continue to look at. And it is something that has so far eluded consensus at the global level. The International Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism is still like the Holy Grail, which has not been defined. There are differences in terms of the definition of an act of terrorism. The time has come for us to put our heads together to see what exactly is terrorism. What is global terrorism? What is cross-border terrorism? What is this phenomenon that can upset the apple cart for all of us? Then there is the T also of tenets, the fifth T of tenets, as in narratives, as in the competing models of governance, social, economic, and cultural progress. These narratives today are challenging the international environment. They are offering a plethora of choices to everybody. And narratives are also backed by information and disinformation today about superiority of one model versus the other. It is a cause for further division, fracturing in the global community. The last T is that of trust, which is the all-important one. More particularly, the lack of trust. Therefore, lack of trust is something that divides this region. And therefore, I would say that the Indo-Pacific is today an interconnected space, both in terms of its maritime as well as continental spaces, that in fact is more representative of the forces unleashed in the 21st century along all these 6 vectors. And especially, it is more representative in terms of accommodating the democratic aspirations of a much wider, larger geography, a much larger population. It is more accommodating of not just aspirations, it is also more reflective of reality today. And so the Indo-Pacific is what will be the future. If these challenges have to be addressed, they'll have to be addressed in a more comprehensive way. So the Asia-Pacific had a certain utility, but it is no longer representative. For the Asia-Pacific does not include South Asia. It excludes the Western Indian Ocean. It excludes Africa. Is that democratic? You might like to ask yourselves. So within this space, the centrality of ASEAN cannot be denied. But ASEAN is also suffering the consequences of its own divisions today. ASEAN, which at a particular juncture had given an example to the rest of the world with its economic integration and security, integration as in consensus over security matters. An ASEAN that in fact relied for both its economic prosperity and its security guarantees on the West, has found that this space today is challenged. It is challenged because while its economic interdependence or dependence shifted towards a large and emerging economy in the People's Republic of China, some of its security paradigms continued to link the region to the West, whether it is the five powers defense arrangements, whether it is some of the bilateral treaty alliance partnerships that some of the ASEAN countries have with, for instance, the United States of America. So this kind of dichotomy crept in on the economic front as well as the security front. A new kind of dependence on a regional context rather than a broader context. And ASEAN is also obviously finding it difficult to reconcile not only its differences in the South China Sea with the People's Republic of China, unable to settle the code of conduct. Incidentally, whatever is decided in the code of conduct between China and the 10 ASEAN countries will actually have implications for the rest of the world. And yet the rest of the world is absent from that particular discourse. But it also has a problem in terms of its vision for the future, particularly with regard to Myanmar. We have increasingly seen how certain ASEAN countries are becoming increasingly dependent on developmental finance, etc. A couple of words, if you permit, about minilateralism, and I'll stop there with a few more words about G20. Minilateralism is not a new phenomenon. I was thinking about it the other day, and I found that even when the UN Security Council was functioning during the Cold War, in a sort of macabre division between the two, camps of the Cold War, it always had three countries that worked in a minilateral within the UN Security Council. Within that unequal system, you always had the United States of America, the UK, and France with their own minilateral in the UN Security Council. We have seen how the voting patterns were uniform, sometimes with regard to, for instance, anti-apartheid resolutions, with regard to the Palestinian issue. So it's not a new phenomenon. Having more than a bilateral relationship and bringing in third countries, whether in a trilateral, quadrilateral, or larger format, is not new. We have seen how the issue of North Korea was sought to be addressed through the six-party talks. We have seen how the P5+1 tried to address the question of a deal with Iran. But today what we are seeing is this mushrooming of minilaterals, and it's a direct result of the inability of the United Nations to function. The United Nations has not been able to function because of its inability to reform. The multinational development banks have not been able to function because of their inability to reform. It is in this space that India, as a G20 chair, seeks to provide a pull-aside station on the highway of gridlock positions and traffic jams, where people can step out of their given positions and engage in a dialogue without losing face. It is in that space that India and Indonesia can work together. I agree that India has a lot to learn from Indonesia's G20 presidency, and we will do all we can to make sure that our presidency is inclusive. Our presidency is not only inclusive in terms of geography, but also on the issue of gender equality. And with Indonesia, India, Brazil, and maybe in the future South Africa consecutively taking on the G20 presidencies, I think there is scope here for us to put our heads together to find a few solutions for a world that is increasingly fractured and under great duress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador, I would like to invite you to sit in front. Now we are going to start our discussion session. In the middle, because you are our special guest. And I would like to invite our next panelists, a wonderful international relation analyst who is also a lecturer at the lecturer of international relations at the University of Indonesia, and he's also a senior fellow at the FPCI to kind of give response to what you have explained previously. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Chaufan. Dr. Chaufan. Please welcome Dr. Chaufan with me. I think now we can start with you giving a comment first, and then we are going to have a question and answer. We are going to have some discussion before we open the floor to the audience. So, what is your take to?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Sujan for the wonderful presentation. I think we learned a lot today, especially as Indonesians, because India is so close yet so far, right? I mean, India present in our everyday life. Our friends' name are, we often see like Indian influence name or Sanskrit names. Even our national airplane Garuda is certainly Vishnu's vehicle. I mean, it's something that shows the connection between India and Indonesia since ancient times. So Indonesia and India has been connected by destiny for centuries. When Ambassador Sujan mentioned about Fasien that connects India and China, we must also remember that during his journey to India, Fasien stopped by in Jawa, in Tarumanegara. So we are also connected in that story too, Ambassador. And of course, in modern times, the connection between India and Indonesia was actually quite strong, especially in the early period of both modern nations. Nehru and then Sukarno and Hatta were in the meetings in the League of Anti-Imperialism, and that's where the idea of independence was also further developed. They again developed this sense of solidarity, the sense of the world as one family in the Pan-ASEAN Relations meeting in New Delhi in 1947, which then became one of the root of the Asian African Conference held in Bandung. So when India and Indonesia meet, the world changed. I think it's a good opportunity today now also, because currently India is the president of the G20, hold the presidency of the G20, and Indonesia held the presidency last year. So we are hoping that some significant influence on our global situation will happen. So, however, I also learned from the presentation by the ambassador that Indonesia and India are also similarly rapidly developing economy, but at the same time is anxious and threatened by the uncertainty of current geopolitical situation. We are rapidly developing, but to sustain this development, we need peace and stability. I think this sentiment are both pretty much evident in both countries. In India, India has the Amrit Kal, if I'm not mistaken. Indonesia has the idea of Indonesia Emas. We are waiting for the 2045 year, the 100th year of the Indonesian independent anniversary. So I think we think rather similarly in many ways. But despite this similarity, I think there are also different approaches in ensuring the security, in ensuring the peace and stability in the region. And as you mentioned, India was very much involved in many initiatives, including the minilateral arrangements, the Quad, etc. While Indonesia sees that these minilateral initiatives somehow is part of that geopolitical tension and could threaten what has been the very much the pillar of Indonesian foreign policy in maintaining stable neighborhood, which is ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. So you have mentioned a few words about this, but I would like to ask more about this different approach between India and Indonesia. How do you see that this different approach can actually be bridged? Different approach in securing the regional stability and peace. Can, for example, the idea of ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, which is proposed by Indonesia and now becoming an ASEAN document and will be further elaborated later during Indonesian presidency, be connected with Indian Ocean policy of India, for example? How possible is that better connection and better understanding between these two nations with similar situation, with similar outlook, but different approach? Can we actually still go with this different approach but understanding each other, or can we actually how to say, somehow connect these different approaches. And second question would be on the G20 issues. Last year, despite the geopolitical tension, there are several, I think, documents and agreements that had been agreed. But the problem with a lot of G20 meetings and many summit meetings are that they stop at declarations, they stop at mentioning the commitments, but lack of continuity. So I'm wondering about how can actually we use this connection between Indonesia, and then Brazil, all our southern countries, all our developing countries can actually use this opportunity of a series of presidencies of these countries to actually have more voices in international politics, which can help us to provide a more peaceful world today, and realize what you have mentioned about that the world is actually one family, sometimes fighting, but it always it should end in a happy situation rather than a conflictual one. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Dr. Sofan. Such a very critical question. So first one is about different approaches, how India, maybe you have a suggestion on, how to deal with that. And the second one is about continuity. Ambassador, please.
Thank you for your appreciation and for your comments on my earlier remarks. I think today there is a certain misconception about the Indo-Pacific, and part of that is motivated. Not that it is driven in ASEAN, by the ASEAN, but that this narrative is being projected towards ASEAN in a certain fashion as to arouse apprehensions. And I think it would be a negation of history, a negation of the simple, democratic aspirational impulse that is informing a much wider region today, to deny or to negate the notion of the Indo-Pacific. I did my best to try and inform you that these are not irreconcilable concepts. These are evolutionary concepts. The Asia-Pacific is now slowly giving way to the Indo-Pacific because of the interconnectedness of geography and all those processes and factors that define our globalized world. I did mention those factors too. And so to negate the Indo-Pacific is, to my mind, quite undemocratic. It is to deny the aspirations of a wider region. To claim that the Asia-Pacific is the only thing that is required is also to say, in a sort of protectionist manner, that we only care about our centrality. I'm not talking about ASEAN centrality. I'm talking about China's centrality. For that particular discourse comes from Beijing, that the Indo-Pacific is a wily, crafty scheme to prevent the rightful rise of China, that the Indo-Pacific will erode the centrality of the ASEAN. To be very frank, this is very far from the truth, because the Indo-Pacific, if anything, is an open, more democratic, more aspirational, more accommodating concept that allows a larger part of humanity to also claim the same prosperity, growth and development that East Asia has experienced. So to claim that the Indo-Pacific is something against the interests of the ASEAN, this cannot really stand the test of scrutiny. Also, if I may ask, a country like Indonesia, if it wants to play, as you claimed, a role as a rising middle power, and as you claim, it's a country that wants to play a greater role in terms of maritime theater and security, how on earth will Indonesia play this role if it is to be confined to the narrow definition of the Indo-Pacific? It is only by stepping out into the broader vision of the Indo-Pacific that Indonesia will also realize its fullest potential. Indonesia, being a large, powerful, populous country, powerful in terms of economy, powerful in terms of its military, navy, etc., has to realize its destiny, like many of us, in a much wider region today that is increasingly interconnected and that is equally entitled to that growth and prosperity. We cannot, by claiming that let's keep it at the Asia Pacific and forget the Indo-Pacific, you are actually denying the East Africans, the countries of the IORA region, their right to grow and prosper. So the Indo-Pacific should never be mistaken for some kind of an anti-China, anti-certain country kind of grouping. That's the false narrative. The problem even with this discourse is that it is being driven from elsewhere. And once you put the cat in among the pigeons in ASEAN, it acquires a momentum of its own, that this is going to erode the centrality of ASEAN. The creators of such a narrative are not concerned about the centrality of ASEAN. They are more concerned about the fading logic of a country-specific region called the Asia Pacific. They are loath to grant that the region has a right as a much larger geography to prosper. So that was the answer to the first question.
And you wanna just go ahead for the second one about continuity, if I'm not mistaken?
Continuity in terms of
G20.
So I do believe that you cannot work miracles in the G20, yet we have to stride out with hope and optimism. Every presidency is a chance to bring to bear some new logic, some new experience, and in the hands of countries like Indonesia, India, this is particularly true because we have that broad vision of wanting to work together, as was demonstrated in the discourse this afternoon. And I do believe that the international order is evolving. It is greatly challenged. The UN system, multilateralism, has become dysfunctional. It is weak. There is much greater multipolarity today than multilateralism. And this multipolarity is along numerous dimensions. So today there is no one country in the world that is able to make its writ felt in every part of the world, on every issue, on every occasion. Those days are over. Power is fractured, and today both states and non-state actors increasingly have acquired the capability to bridge absolute gaps and asymmetries in comprehensive national power. And they can do this through technology. They can do this by proliferating, by having a few bombs and missiles in the basement, as in the case of North Korea. They can do it by using cyber attacks. They can do it by using terrorism to destroy peace and stability. In this kind of a situation, it is vital that countries like India and Indonesia think of new solutions. Now, does the answer lie in simply castigating the United Nations and rejecting it? Absolutely not. In fact, we have to seek ways and means to either reform the United Nations, which has remained untouched. At least the UN Security Council has not seen reforms. You are aware that in 1945, when the UN was set up, it was after a trial and error experience of 2 decades in which the Treaty of Versailles had failed miserably in 1919, and the League of Nations that followed in 1920 also was dead on arrival. It was dead on arrival because President Woodrow Wilson, who in fact was nicknamed Mr. Democracy, he had great empathy for developing countries and countries of Latin America, a certain degree of sympathy for large, poor Asian countries as well. He himself bailed out of, in fact, the US never supported the League of Nations. And those that did, powers like Germany, Japan, Italy, the Soviet Union, at one point or another in the 1930s, either exited the League of Nations or were removed from the League of Nations. By the time you reach the end of that 2-decade period, the world was ready once again for a major world war, that is World War II. And that's exactly what happened. And Franklin Roosevelt, on the eve of the Great War, was already speaking of a post-war scenario, the four global policemen, spheres of influence and stuff like that. So that's an archaic kind of thinking. 1945, 5 permanent members, veto power, etc. We have to get up and smell the coffee today. The power quotient, balance of power has changed in the last 77 years. Yet that structure does not reflect it. Ditto in the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF till today being the main, what you call sort of development bank lender of finance for fiscal stability and macroeconomics, is lending on the basis of an archaic principle of quota systems and SDRs. Now, the quota systems and SDRs were supposed to reflect the relative power of those economies in the global economy at that point of time. Would you not agree today that those contributions have dramatically altered? For why is it otherwise that China in 2010 was 10.5% of the global GDP, and yet its SDRs, even when enhanced, stayed at only 6.5? A fairly relatively diminished power like the UK, which has been overtaken in economic terms by India, still has more quota and SDR in the IMF today at 6.4% or so, as compared to India, which is at 2.75%. So that system itself was suitable for a certain period of history. It is no longer reflecting realities today. And so the G20 has to think of new ways to resolve some of these issues outside of those structures, but without challenging those structures. And I think one way to do it is to have a discourse on some low-hanging fruit. These countries are unable to exit or stand down from their given positions in those structures without losing face. And they may all see merit if we offer another sort of salon for them to discuss and debate in a wise and orderly manner, without linking everything to the war in Ukraine, without linking everything to the pandemic, without holding hostage or to ransom even the low-hanging fruit.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Let me follow up on that. And this question is both for Mr. Ambassador and Dr. Chaufan as well. If Indo-Pacific, and I like the way you frame Indo-Pacific, it's the result of history. It's the product of historical evolution. If it is indeed something that, evolved from history a long time ago, now we reap the fruits of it, how India, as the G20, holding G20 presidency, take the momentum of being the presidency of G20, develop such concept, and not only concept but also implementation, take the opportunities that Indo-Pacific could offer to all of us. What should be done? India and Indonesia work together, utilizing or taking advantages or opportunities that the Indo-Pacific offer us through this G20 framework.
You'd like to answer, please. So I believe that I think countries like Indonesia and India should work together, particularly with regard to, for instance, climate, the challenge of climate change and climate finance, for instance. We have to look for ways and means to allow, greater private sector participation and also hybrid finance for developmental activities. We have to look for some consensus even on issues such as healthcare, another area where large populous countries like India and Indonesia can work together. For instance, on IP of vaccines, where countries like India and South Africa have stood for, the waivers. So these are things that we should support because, as I said in my remarks this morning, what we need is not just a dose of reforms per se. We need a dose of vaccination to inject in our way of thinking a certain degree of ethics and morality also. this country-specific beggar thy neighbor, during a pandemic, unwillingness of many, developed countries to share even the vaccines. It contrasts with the kind of culture we have, or one in which we will put, society before self, and by society I mean the global society. It is countries like India that went out of their way to give 250 million doses to 101 countries at the peak of the pandemic, before we had even vaccinated our own people. And we have successfully vaccinated our own people. We've administered 2 billion doses to a population that is 1.4 billion. So I think there is scope here to work on cyber. Today our health is threatened, not just by pandemics. It's also the economic health is threatened by cyberspace, about the movement of data, data security. So there are many areas where I think we need to muster that kind of momentum. And if we speak with one voice, we should be able to do it. I think India's ability to relate to the contending powers today, and its ability to have credibility with the two sides, whether it is the United States and Russia, even on issues to bridge the gap, I think that will help us to reach out to others.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Shofan, do you have something to say about this? What should be done? I mean, from the Indonesian side.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear, and I think the Indonesia's position is quite similar. That current multilateral system is facing a serious challenge, and it's becoming less effective. And G20 is a platform where we could actually provide innovative pathways to somehow rejuvenate the multilateralism, and by taking some important issues specifically. And in Indonesia's term, for example, what Indonesia would like to do was by becoming the channel for the voices of the developing countries, in which I think is quite similar with India's position currently. There was a discussion on global pandemic fund, on the energy transition fund, on how we can actually achieve the energy transition without sacrificing the need for development. I think these challenges are feasible in the calculations of many developing countries, but often missing in the developed countries because they are already there. The trade-off between development and environment, the impact of the climate change, which is actually pretty much related to the historical contribution to the climate change itself, not only at the current situation, are the perspectives that need to be further pushed. Because the voices of the developing countries, small island developing countries, least developing countries, are often neglected in international platforms. So I think these opportunities where India, Indonesia, and other developing countries have the power to set the stage. I mean, by becoming the presidency of G20, you are setting the stage, and you, as Ambassador has mentioned, one of the T is tenet, is the narrative. I mean, and by becoming the presidency, you are setting the stage, you are setting the tenet, you are setting the discussion for at least that particular year, and hopefully can last, can have a lasting impact on that. So I think it is important to not only looking at the role of India or role of Indonesia, but looking at India and Indonesia as both part of the larger community of the often forgotten in the global politics. So I think by doing so, there are a lot of things that Indonesia, both Indonesia and India, could do and work together. And I think that is also connected to the discussion on Indo-Pacific, in which there was also a different versions of it. What I can take from your answer is that it is a socially constructed discourse, and it is important for us in the region to define it rather than to let external powers to define what Indo-Pacific is. So I think it is important for India and Indonesia to talk more, to connect more, rather than talking through external partners. So we will have a lot of discussions on Indo-Pacific with Pacific powers, with US, Japan, with China, but I think there's quite limited connections and discussions between Indonesia and India on this Indo-Pacific vision. So I think it is important, and I think this momentum of G20 presidency from Indonesia and India could be used also as a vehicle of that, because Indo-Pacific is a nexus of the 60 that you mentioned. It's the nexus of trade, technology, territory. All of these T's are having that nexus in Indo-Pacific. So I think what I can take from today's discussion is that we need another T, talk more, between India and Indonesia. And I think people-to-people connections like this can help us to understand why India took this approach, why Indonesia takes this approach, and then somehow maybe we can develop something new that can contribute to the creation of a better world.
May I just add here that the rise of minilaterals, including, for instance, between India, Indonesia, and Australia, or for that matter, between India, France, and Australia. All these eventually are given to creating a better understanding of the larger concepts and dimensions. And the big powers also see advantage, because were they to come to the region simply with their identities as major powers and long-standing stakeholders in this region, they arouse greater suspicion. When they come in through large countries like Indonesia, like India, we are in a position to give a more acceptable salience to their capacities and to interpret it for the needs of the region, and to also add our own to that. The other point I want to make about the ability of India and Indonesia to work together with regard to climate change is on this all-important idea proposed by the Prime Minister of India called Lifestyle for Environment. Now, we've talked enough in different fora of the need to ensure that global warming is restricted to 1.5% or at least kept under the larger goal of 2 degrees. By some accounts, this is going to be impossible. And countries like India and Indonesia can take the lead in doing something about it. Now, in India's case, for instance, the Prime Minister declared at COP26 the concept of Panchamrit, the 5 ambrosia, the 5 nectars, the goal of increasing our clean energy to 500 kilowatts by 2030, or by reducing to 50% our fossil fuel-based energy, by reducing our total carbon emissions by 1 billion tons by 2030, or for that matter, achieving net zero by 2070. These goals that we have set for ourselves are, and also reducing our carbon intensity in the economy to 45%. So these 5 goals are very important. On life, the key point here is that between Indonesia and India, we make up for a large part of humankind. And if we follow what Mahatma Gandhi said, that be the change that you seek in the world. If we begin with the most fundamental denominator, that is the human being, and start altering our behavior to create a planet that is full of pro-planet people, then large geographies like India and Indonesia with large populations will be able to better protect their environment. So the behavioral change will come from the individual and will move towards what you call sustainable consumption. And this is this key idea that Prime Minister Modi has proposed. For far too long, we are depending on the salons of New York and other capitals to solve our problems. Maybe we can make a beginning ourselves and show the others the way forward.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's very insightful. There's one tradition that the India and Indonesia share that I like the most. It's the story of Ramayana. Maybe all of us know Ramayana. There is one line that I like, Mr. Ambassador. It goes like this. Wise men say that the root of victory is consultation and discussion with learned and wise men. So by saying that, we are going to open the Q&A to the floor. Let's make this is as a learning space. You know, if you have any questions, those in the Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to type your questions. We'll be more than happy to read your questions to our panelists. Those in the room, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll give you the mic. So, okay, 1, 2, one more? Oh, 3. Oh, okay. Okay. So, please state your name and then your affiliation and then the question. We have one over there and one over here.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Alif Arya Putra. I'm from the University of Professor Dr. Mustopo. So I would like first to thank you, FPCI, His Excellency Ambassador Sujan, and Professor Aswan for this delightful, Sofwan, for this delightful opportunity. So, head to the question. How can India enact its neighbor first policy when the neighbors around India are currently under the weather, if you would say? So, for example, nations like Sri Lanka facing its failed state, how Myanmar with its political instability because of the military junta, ubiquitous human rights abuses in Bangladesh, or the Afghanistan led by the Taliban, or the Pakistan economic crisis, or the current flood crisis in Pakistan. So if South Asia is a fire and India is the fireman, how would you put out that fire? Thank you very much.
You know, India is always a country that will put out the fires. It will not set fires like some do. So that's the big difference here. So let me begin by simply saying that it's vital for large countries when they grow and emerge to have some kind of A, regional consensus on their rise, B, relatively, a relative tandem in terms of growth and development for the region as well. If these two narratives are absent, it tends to reduce the trajectory. It acts as a drag on growth and development. Now, most countries like the United States, for instance, grew in their part of the world. It did so with a certain degree of recognition and consensus. But it does not mean that every country on its borders grew at the same pace or that became equally prosperous, because we have seen how Mexico did not live up to that particular definition, and even less so countries of South America. If you look at China's rise, you find that it's also not without a certain drag in terms of the history and baggage of disputes, models, whether democratic or open, liberal versus closed, and the disputes, etc. So India's is not a unique situation in its neighborhood, that India is moving at 6.8% growth rate, and there are countries that are in fact being forced to go to the IMF with a begging bowl, and that even that assistance is not forthcoming. What India can do and is doing is, as I mentioned earlier, with the neighborhood first policy, to offer as much of aid and assistance in a partnership model at a level that is comfortable for the recipient state based on the priorities of the recipient state. So I think we should call it a partnership, not aid and assistance. Secondly, we do that without any expectation of reciprocity. So there are no sort of hidden usurious clauses here. There is no desire that India has to take over, a port or territory and establish extraterritorial rights should you fail to pay the loan. I told you, we are in the business of dousing fires, not setting fires, As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, you must be aware that of Sri Lanka's total external debt, if I'm not mistaken, of roughly 38 billion, 37.5 billion US dollars, India holds the third largest. In fact, the debt that Sri Lanka owes to India is much less than what it owes to China at about 7.5 billion. And even Japan, the debt to Japan is higher than that of India. And yet it is India that at the time of the crisis resolved some of the key issues for Sri Lanka by offering timely quantities of fuel, food, and also providing roughly $4 billion by way of assistance. The provision of assistance was the largest by India. No other country gave that much of assistance to Sri Lanka in an hour of need for them. So India is ready to do that. I mean, look at Afghanistan. India was and remains on the list of donors, one of the top developmental partners for Afghanistan, with having spent more than $3 billion US dollars for developing projects in Afghanistan from, for instance, the Friendship Dam, earlier known as the Salma Dam, which is towards the Iranian border, or for instance, the Phule Kumri, power transmission plant and transmission lines, or for that matter, building the Temple to Democracy. The Parliament building itself in Kabul is a gift of the people of India. And more than 100 small capacity developmental programs throughout Afghanistan, especially with focus on gender equality and projects that would benefit women and the girl child, etc. So we've been doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting for the region. This is not to speak of extending assistance during disasters, natural disasters, as we did after the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, when the region was from Aceh to Africa. Everybody was reeling under the effects. India was one of the first countries to come to the help and assistance. We've done that for Sri Lanka. We've done that during the water crisis in the Maldives, during earthquakes in Nepal. And I'm not listing for you all that we do for Nepal and Bangladesh. The budgets for some of these countries for developmental activities is larger than what we would extend to some of our own states, which are far more populous and bigger in terms of geography. As far as Myanmar is concerned, we have to understand that it's a complex situation and that we have to find ways and means to get Myanmar back onto a normal track which integrates it more closely to its natural constituency in the ASEAN. This is important because you don't want it integrated into an unnatural space which lies elsewhere, not ASEAN. That exploitative relationship that can form in Myanmar when it is, so to speak, in the doghouse and being isolated is far more dangerous than anything that you might have seen up to now. India is mindful of this. India is doing what it can to ensure that the developmental processes in Myanmar are not thwarted. That is why even for the Rohingyas and all, we have offered in the Arakan state, we have offered assistance for housing, etc. And we continue that developmental partnership with Myanmar. After all, you don't want to punish the people who are innocent, in Myanmar. What have the people to do with this? So governments come and go, regimes come and go, but we have to be mindful of the people everywhere. I think if you follow that objective, we will be able to redefine the geostrategic space. We should not be defining geostrategic space only in terms of hard power. We should also be defining geostrategic space today in terms of soft power.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to FPCI for hosting this event. As a student of the School of Diplomacy, I do miss Padino Janal at this event. Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy and Pasiofan. So my question to you is, of course, India's, like you rightly mentioned, India's profile internationally has increased in recent years. My question is on the capacity, like how has, and it is expected to grow in the coming years as well. But how is, what are your thoughts on the capacity, for example, capacity building to meet those challenges of the government, of the foreign service, of think tanks, and what is the role of the think tank, for example? How can we, as private sector individuals, can help build that capacity in order to execute the ambitious goals that you've highlighted? Because my sense is, and I've lived in China before, I've been here for the past 6 years, I've seen a massive change in the interest in international relations that people are taking in India, in the articulation of India's foreign policy that we see on the international stage. And I can just see a wealth of opportunities and challenges going forward. But how are we preparing, how is the country preparing to increase the capacity to deal with those challenges in order to execute?
So you're right in pointing out that this is a different kind of G20 presidency, and without sounding immodest, let me point out that the one unique thing about this G20 presidency of India is that it is the people's presidency. 1.4 billion people today in India have been made aware of the G20 presidency and all that it entails in terms of the increasingly seamless connectivity between what happens in the country today and what happens on the external front today. That being a given, it is vital that the people of any country participate in its processes that work to redefine the nation's place in the Committee of Nations. And so, unlike any other presidency, and that I would imagine includes Indonesia, the Indian presidency is defined by taking the notion of G20 to all the people of India. In fact, right from the word go, the Indian G20 Secretariat got off to a very good start, and enormous number of people have been given on loan to the G20 Secretariat, which is part of the Ministry of External Affairs, but today seems to be larger than the ministry itself, and rightly so, because of the enormous responsibility that we have. All the engagement groups also got off to an extraordinarily quick start. In fact, the Think 20 was in the lead. Today it's being cited variously at G20 Secretariat meetings also as the one that got off to the finest start with the kind of outreach that we are creating in the country. So we are working in parallel. The G20 Secretariat has informed all member countries. We are going to do more than 200 events in more than 50 cities. But we are not far behind. Every engagement group, whether it is Think 20, whether it is W20, whether it is Y20, whether it is Civil 20, are doing dozens of outreach events within the country, within the region, as well as across the world. I myself have done a large event, Think 20, G20 event, side event with South Asian countries. And I invited to my institute some 16 to 18 scholars to speak and debate about the themes before the G20, not on defense and security. So this kind of a thing. And India is also focused heavily on creating skilled manpower today. Skilled manpower is one of the, Skill India is one of the flagship programs of the government of India over the last 8 years or so. So enormous amount of resources are being devoted to this space in India. The think tank community in India has matured. I think there was a time when we had only a few well-known think tanks, my think tank being one, set up in 1965. It has a very credible and respected past. The Indian Council for World Affairs of the Ministry of External Affairs is another one. But there were few. and there were no think tanks virtually in other cities of India. Today, in the last decade or so, we have seen a mushrooming of think tanks all over India and in state capitals and cities as well. This multitude of think tanks also needs to be brought together to work seamlessly as one force. They may have independence of functioning, different budgets, they may have their own viewpoints, but they need to talk to one another. And this is where the Prime Minister's vision kicks in. He has a vision which is aimed at creating dialogue between think tanks also. You see, my very appointment as the Think 20 chair should be indicative to you. For the first time in the history of the G20, there is a chair that has been appointed in one place and a secretariat to support the chair that is appointed in another place. And this is a message that the time has come for think tanks to also learn to work with each other, not at cross purposes, not duplicating efforts, not creating unnecessary redundancies, wastage of resources, talking to the same people, inviting the same people. Why can't we do it together? Please express your independent views, but at least let's work together. So overnight, I'm working with institutes that basically they are different from my institute. So I work with the ORF, which is very good at organizing large events and outreach. I certainly am working with RIS, and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi supports my work with his able understanding of G20 issues, and there are others also. So we are creating the manpowers necessary, including in the foreign ministry. There is great emphasis today under the current leadership of the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, and also our dynamic Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, of enhancing manpower, human resources in the Ministry of External Affairs. We have been taking in consultants. We have been recruiting larger numbers for our diplomatic needs. We will have to do more on that front.
A separate foreign service exam at some point in India? Is that
well, I don't know about that. That would be part of broader reforms to the Union Public Service Commission recruitment system. That may take longer. But certainly encouraging talent to come in. Government is also taking in, to some extent, technocrats. We don't quite have the revolving door system of the United States of America, where academics freely come into government and then go out. And so a Matt Pottinger will be a journalist one day, then assistant to the president on China the other day in the United States, and then again he's back to some think tank or a Lisa Curtis. No, we don't have that kind of a system. But we are increasingly encouraging specialists and technically qualified people to come into government at certain levels and to participate in this process. But I do see a point here. In fact, over lunch I was telling a few colleagues that this is an age in which you need greater specialization. And so the civil services in India and the Indian Foreign Service will also have to increasingly focus on specialization. There can be a generalist cadre also for generalist type of jobs. But a one size fits all should be avoided, because they are not able then to contribute their best to a certain task at hand. So we need to create specialist branches within the Ministry of External Affairs, and I think some thought is being given to all of this. We do have a certain degree of regional specialization that's been around for many years. I mean, I am an East Asia specialist, or you can say my career has revolved around China, 42 years on the trot. But we see other geographies and other themes also now coming up for specialization. And that's a good thing.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, we have so many questions. So I think we can entertain one question from the YouTube. Yeah. Okay, let me just choose this one. From Intan in the YouTube. So the question is, post-Nehru time, India seemed to distance itself from multilateralism. But today it seems like India is like, more keen to embrace multilateralism. So what may have brought forward these changes?
Personally, I don't agree that post-Nehru, India has moved away from multilateralism and is now coming back to multilateralism. India was never out of multilateralism. In fact, India was one of the first countries, including during the Nehruvian period, to speak up for the global south, to speak up for the Afro-Asian community against colonialism, against apartheid, alongside Indonesia and other countries. India worked hard to create a world in which powers like Indonesia and India would have a voice, that we would be non-aligned. We worked hard to create that kind of broad consensus at the Bandung conference also. So India has never been out of the game, so to speak. I think some of the priorities have changed. Take, for instance, proliferation and disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. One of the greatest advocates of general and complete disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, the nuclear test ban treaty, was India in the 1950s. In fact, India was front and center in the discourse that led to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty also. But that discourse was predicated on the notion that the interlocutors would agree to create a fair and equal level playing field, that it would not be a world which is destined to keep some in permanent bondage and hostage to possession of nuclear weapons by a few privileged ones. So this discourse is complex, but the point I'm making to you is that India has never been out of the multilateral space. We have worked hard right from the time of the creation of GATT to the creation of the WTO. India has been very active in trade negotiations. India has been active with regard to initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Even with regard to islands at COP26, Prime Minister spoke of resilient infrastructure for island nations, a unique concept for those that are most vulnerable. So I think the multilateral space that we are speaking of is being increasingly redefined. But multilateralism has always been part of our vision, because how else do we live up to our own tenets and ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world is a family. It requires us to look beyond our borders in a pro bono manner at the requirements of humankind in general. So we are wedded to the notion of multilateralism. But a multilateralism that is gamed, a multilateralism that is exploited by a few, is something that we reject. Let me give you an example. It comes to my mind. In 1945, when the permanent members were appointed, there was no real yardstick for appointing any permanent member. If there was one, it was the notion that to the victor go all the spoils. And in that, to add a wee bit of, shall I say, quote unquote, color, the great powers decided that a large agrarian, overpopulated, poor country from Asia be also added. That is how the Republic of China became a permanent member in 1945. Was it the possession of nuclear weapons that allowed them to become permanent members? No. Only one country had demonstrated capacity for possession and use, the dreadful use also of nuclear weapons. That was the United States of America. The other four had no nuclear weapons. Today, the narrative is that the permanent members of the Security Council are the nuclear weapon states. Mind you, the possession of nuclear weapons and the identity as nuclear weapon states was what you call a result of that privileged position in the UN Security Council. It is not nuclear weapons that made them permanent members. Later, the two narratives were conjoined. So, if you don't call that exploitation of your privileged position as permanent members, then what would you call exploitation? So, we need to redefine multilateral space. What is multilateralism? Multilateralism does not mean that the stakeholders, the recipients of developmental finance have no say in the matter. As I said earlier in my talk today, that the quota system is the most archaic system that you can look for. It's still guiding the IMF and its SDRs. To give $650 billion worth of extra SDRs to developing countries during the time of distress as it did once, it's a one-off thing. And yet the same IMF charges $4 billion by way of surcharge today on loans and assistance in the year 2022. If this is not paid, it has drastic results on the borrowing countries. So what kind of multilateralism do you want for tomorrow? Do you want a multilateralism in which there is multipolarity only at the global level? Or do you also want some multipolarity at the regional level? China, for instance, is working hard to create multipolarity at the global level. That's commendable. But how about some multipolarity in Asia as well? Is Asia supposed to, not aspire to multipolarity? Does it necessarily have to be dominated by a particular power? So let's make this space, a just space. And let's try to work with some ethics there.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I believe we all learned greatly today. Unfortunately, we have so limited time. So I hope this is just only the beginning of many other dialogues that the Think 20 can promote among the members and also non-members. I heard this morning that the dialogue would be extended to even non-members of G20. So I hope FPCI, Think 20 would be would take the initiative to extend such privilege, such engagement. So I would like to thank again Mr. Ambassador, Dr. Sofwan. Thank you. And I'm going to, and thank you for our audience. So let's give another round of applause to our speakers and to all of us. Thank you for coming. Now I'm going to give it back to the MC. And I got a message that the panelists should just stay on the stage. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amelia, for moderating the session. And once again, thank you to His Excellency Sujan Chinoy and Dr. Sofwan for the very insightful discussion. Thank you, honorable guests. And I'm sure that everybody has learned a lot from the session, especially on India's foreign policy, G20, and Indo-Pacific dynamics. So once again, please give a warm round of applause for all of our speakers here. Now, honorable guests and panelists, we would like to invite you to take a picture together on the stage. And so Mr. Ahmed and also Ambassador Najib, you could come to the stage and our photographer will take a picture. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe committees, please assist. All right, thank you very much to our honorable panelists and distinguished guests. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our event today. We thank you all for joining us both in person at the venue and through online live streaming on our YouTube. This public forum is also available for a rewatch at our YouTube channel, Secretariat FPCI. Please make sure that you have followed us on social media for more information on our future activities and events. If you have not, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at FPC Indo. And ladies and gentlemen, for your information, we have snacks and drinks in the room over there, in the room next door. So please feel free to have some before you leave. Once again, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and see you at our next event.